Nashed, The Vanishing Hitchhiker, Part 1. It was a chilly autumn night and the mist rolled in thick and fast as I drove down the desolate country road. The clock on my dashboard read 11:45 p.m., but the heavy blanket of fog made it feel later. My headlights pierced the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the trees that lined the road like silent sentinels. I had been driving for hours, lost in the labyrinth of back roads after visiting an old friend in a neighboring town. My GPS had long given up and my phone signal was non-existent. As I contemplated pulling over to check the map I had in the glove compartment, I saw her. She stood at the side of the road, her figure barely discernible through the mist. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, dressed in a thin white dress that fluttered in the breeze. She had no coat, no bag, nothing that indicated she was prepared for the cold night air. Her long dark hair framed a pale face, and her eyes seemed to reflect the headlights as she raised her thumb, asking for a ride. Instinctively, I slowed down and pulled over. She approached the car with a hesitant grace, as if unsure whether she should accept my offer. I rolled down the window and asked, "Do you need a lift?" "Yes, thank you," she replied, her voice soft and distant, like a whisper carried by the wind. I unlocked the passenger door and she climbed in, settling into the seat with an air of relief. As she fastened her seatbelt, I couldn't help but notice how cold she looked. "You must be freezing. Do you need a blanket or something?" She shook her head. "No, I'm fine. I just need to get home." "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation as I resumed driving. "Just down the road a bit. There's a house, you'll see it," she replied vaguely, her gaze fixed out the window. Silence fell between us, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional hoot of an owl. Something about her demeanor made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off. After all, she was just a hitchhiker needing a ride. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the whole situation. After a few minutes, she turned to me and spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for picking me up. Not many people would have stopped." "No problem," I said, forcing a smile. "It's not safe out here at night." She nodded, a sad smile playing on her lips. "It hasn't been safe for a long time." I glanced at her, puzzled by her words, but before I could ask her to elaborate, she pointed ahead. "There, that's where I need to go." Through the fog, I saw the outline of an old, dilapidated house. Its windows were dark, and the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect. It looked abandoned, but I pulled into the driveway nonetheless. "Are you sure this is the place?" I asked, my apprehension growing. "Yes," she replied, her voice firmer now. "This is home." She unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out into the night. "Thank you again," she said, her figure already fading into the mist. "Wait," I called out, but she was gone, swallowed by the fog. I sat there for a moment, staring at the empty space where she had stood, a chill running down my spine. With a sense of foreboding, I turned the car around and drove away, the image of the ghostly hitchhiker etched into my mind. Little did I know this encounter was only the beginning of a mystery that would haunt me for years to come. The Vanishing Hitchhiker, Part 2. A week had passed since that eerie night, and I couldn't shake the memory of the hitchhiker. Her pale face and the way she disappeared into the fog haunted my thoughts. I found myself avoiding that road, taking longer routes to bypass it entirely. Yet the more I tried to forget, the more intrigued I became. One evening, driven by a mix of curiosity and a need for closure, I decided to return to the old, dilapidated house. I left early enough to avoid the oppressive darkness, but late enough to ensure I wouldn't encounter too many people. As I drove, the familiar unease crept back in, but I pressed on, determined to find answers. When I reached the house, it looked just as abandoned and forlorn as before. I parked my car on the roadside and approached the gate, which creaked ominously as I pushed it open. The overgrown path leading to the front door was lined with weeds and fallen leaves, crunching under my feet with each step. Standing at the door, I hesitated. What was I expecting to find? Gathering my courage, I knocked. The sound echoed through the empty house, but there was no response. I tried the door, and to my surprise, it opened with a reluctant groan. Inside, the house was a time capsule, frozen in a bygone era. Dust-covered furniture and cobwebs adorned every corner. The air was thick with the scent of decay and neglect. As I wandered through the rooms, a sense of sadness washed over me, as if the house itself mourned for its past occupants. In the living room, I found a series of old photographs on the mantel. Most were faded and yellowed with age, but one caught my eye. It was a portrait of a family, a man, a woman, and a young girl. The girl looked remarkably like the hitchhiker I'd picked up. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the photograph. Who was she? I needed answers. Driven by a mix of fear and determination, I decided to visit the local library. Maybe I could find some information about the house and its former residents. At the library, the librarian was an elderly woman who seemed to know everything about the town's history. When I mentioned the house, her eyes widened slightly, and she motioned for me to follow her. She led me to a back room filled with old newspapers and town records. "It's been years since anyone asked about that place," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "It's been abandoned for as long as I can remember." She helped me sift through the records until we found an article from decades ago. The headline read, "Tragic accident claims young life." The article detailed a car accident that had occurred on that very road, resulting in the death of a young woman named Emily. The accompanying photograph confirmed my suspicions. It was the hitchhiker. As I read on, chills ran down my spine. Emily had been walking home when she was struck by a car on a foggy night, much like the night I had encountered her. The article mentioned that she lived in the old house with her parents, who had moved away after her death, unable to bear the memories. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Emily had died tragically, and her spirit had been lingering, waiting for someone to help her find her way home. I realized that by giving her a ride, I had somehow connected with her restless soul. My mind raced with questions. Why had she appeared to me? What did she want? As I left the library, a sense of purpose filled me. I had to return to the house, to find a way to bring Emily peace, and finally put her spirit to rest. The Vanishing Hitchhiker, Part 3. Armed with the knowledge of Emily's tragic fate, I felt a heavy responsibility to help her find peace. The thought of returning to the abandoned house at night filled me with dread, but I knew it was something I had to do. I gathered a few items I thought might be helpful. A flashlight, a notepad, and a bouquet of flowers. It felt right to bring some small gesture of kindness. That night, as the clock struck midnight, I parked my car at the edge of the property and approached the house once more. The air was thick with the same eerie mist, and the silence was almost oppressive. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever lay ahead, and pushed open the creaking gate. The path to the house seemed longer this time, each step weighed down by a mix of fear and anticipation. I reached the front door and pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the house was just as cold and lifeless as before, but I felt an unexplainable presence, as if I was being watched. I made my way to the living room where I had found the photograph. Placing the flowers on the mantel, I whispered, "Emily, I'm here to help you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a cold breeze swept through the room, and I heard the faintest sound of footsteps. I turned around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. "Emily, if you're here, please show yourself," I called out, my voice trembling. The air grew colder, and a soft light began to form in the corner of the room. Slowly, the light took shape, and there she was, Emily, the hitchhiker, standing before me. Her expression was one of sorrow, but there was also a hint of hope in her eyes. "I don't understand why you've come to me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What can I do to help you?" Emily didn't speak, but she gestured toward the photograph on the mantel. I picked it up, studying the faces once more. The family looked happy, their smiles frozen in time, unaware of the tragedy that would befall them. Suddenly, an idea struck me. "Is there something you need to say to your family?" I asked. Emily nodded, a single tear rolling down her cheek. She pointed to a piece of paper and a pen on the old writing desk in the corner of the room. I walked over and picked them up, then handed them to her. She took the pen and began to write, her hand moving with an urgency that spoke of years of pent-up emotions. When she finished, she handed me the note. It was addressed to her parents, a heartfelt message of love and apology. She had never meant to leave them so soon, and she wanted them to know she was at peace now. "I'll find them," I promised. "I'll make sure they get your message." Emily smiled, a sense of calm washing over her. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the broken windows, her form grew fainter. She raised a hand in a gesture of farewell, and then she was gone, her spirit finally at rest. With the note clutched in my hand, I knew my journey wasn't over. I had one final task: to find Emily's parents and deliver her message. As I left the old house, the weight of her sorrow lifted, replaced by a sense of fulfillment. I had helped her find peace, and in doing so, had found a new purpose for myself. Shishai, The Vanishing Hitchhiker, Part 4. Finding Emily's parents proved to be a challenge. The article had mentioned their names, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, but gave no indication of their current whereabouts. I spent days scouring public records, visiting old neighbors, and leaving messages at places they might have frequented. My search led me to a small nearby town where an old acquaintance mentioned they had moved to a retirement community. Armed with this new lead, I made my way to the community, hoping against hope that they were still there. As I arrived, the receptionist greeted me warmly. When I explained my purpose, she looked thoughtful for a moment and then nodded. "Yes, the Thompsons live here. Would you like me to call them down?" My heart pounded in my chest. "Yes, please." A few minutes later, an elderly couple approached. They were frail, but there was a grace and dignity in their movements. Mr. Thompson had a cane, and Mrs. Thompson clutched his arm for support. They looked at me with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," I began, my voice steady despite my nerves. "My name is Alex. I have something that belongs to you, something from Emily." At the mention of their daughter's name, their expressions softened into one of surprise and sorrow. "Emily?" Mrs. Thompson whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes," I said, handing them the note. "I met her on the road one night. She wanted me to give you this." Mr. Thompson unfolded the paper with trembling hands, and together they read the heartfelt message their daughter had written. Tears streamed down their faces, and Mrs. Thompson clutched the note to her chest, her sobs quiet but intense. "She never meant to leave you," I said gently. "She wants you to know she's at peace now." For a long moment, they simply held each other, the weight of years of grief and unanswered questions finally lifting. When they looked up at me, their expressions were filled with gratitude and relief. "Thank you," Mr. Thompson said, his voice choked with emotion. "We've waited so long to hear from her." Mrs. Thompson nodded, wiping her eyes. "We can finally find peace, knowing she's at rest." As I left the retirement community, I felt a profound sense of closure. Emily's message had brought solace to her parents, and had helped her spirit move on. I knew I had done the right thing, and the eerie encounter on that foggy road now felt like a distant memory. Driving home, the road seemed less daunting, the mist less oppressive. I had faced the unknown and had come out on the other side, forever changed by the experience. Emily's story had intertwined with mine, and I knew I would carry the lessons of that night with me always. And so, the Vanishing Hitchhiker was no longer a mystery, but a poignant reminder that some connections transcend time and space, bringing peace to those who seek it.